final recommendation gets presented to you, like I said earlier, the Selectmen, the school committee, and the finance committee.
Mike,
And then,
just a question,
yes.
on the, check of the referral thing, you see what, 2/3 after, before it becomes a recommendation?
What have we been using? I'm sorry. We've been using majority.
I thought it was a majority.
I'm just curious, as far as the, I mean, if there's, I mean, I don't know what any of the recommendations have been thus far, but if there's something that's close to split, even, but doesn't prevail,
Right.
is it gonna get lost somewhere?
No, it won't, because,
Okay.
you know what? If it gets to that point, if we ever had something like that, we would come to you. We would seek your help. If we felt that we were split down the middle, we would reach out to the school committee, if it's related to them, or the finance committee, or yourselves, and help us get through the process. Again, this is a true partnership. We're not gonna make all those decisions on our own, so
Yeah, I just wanna make sure, I'd wanna hear it, I wanna see the ideas and
Oh,
hear
it's a
them,
great
yeah.
question. That's how we would handle it.
Excuse me, Mike, but
Sure.
if I understood the form you're using and the process, if it gets voted down, it's still on the form with all of the
It gets,
rationale,
It's
so.
still memorialized somewhere.
we're gonna turn it into you. You're gonna see it. You're gonna get it. But you're gonna see it with our recommendation that we're rejecting it. So you can decide to put it on the shelf. And matter of fact, everything that we're doing, I am making sure I have it all cataloged and it's all gonna be put away. So if something comes up in the future, we can pull it back up. Okay? And I'm gonna have it all burnt on CDs, so there'll be multiple copies. Okay, and then action, which is one of the most important things. Once we submit them over to the right committees, including the town departments, it's up to them to, if you approve them, you want them to happen, then we have to leave the action to get done by you. You have to force the action. We don't feel that that's gonna be our area at all. Okay, here's the selected ideas that we picked for our discussion this evening. We've had a lot of talk about split tax rate, and I think maybe I've been here almost 6 years in town. I've only heard it over the last couple of years, but we're gonna talk a little bit about it tonight. We as a committee, we love the idea. Controlling the rising cost in healthcare insurance, health insurance. It's a major issue, not only here, not only in town government, it's in all businesses, including my business. It's been a major issue. We're gonna talk about it tonight, and I think we have some great information for you to hear. Can we afford our schools? Level services budgets that get presented to you every year. Can we afford them? It's something we have to talk about. Maybe we have to talk about the process in which we're doing it. I don't know what has to change right now, but we have to explore it. And overtime, can we truly afford the overtime that this town takes on across all departments? Unfortunately, I don't want the fire department to feel we're picking on them, but we're just using them as an example tonight. We have many other examples, not just the fire department, but we decided to pick on them. Because we're picking on everybody a little bit tonight, and you'll see that as we go. And then can we afford the employee benefits, which I talked about earlier? So the first idea is the split tax rate, and Mr. Kirby is gonna come up, and I'm gonna stand over here to the side, and he's gonna run you through that. What I'd ask is that let him go through the slides for the split tax rate, and then if you wanna ask questions afterwards, no problem at all.
And Mike, I think we had some technical challenges. I don't believe this first slide is in your printed materials, so I'm actually going to speak to the first slide, and if need be, we can get sort of a hard copy.
Yeah, I will give you that slide and send it out to everybody. This is the only slide that's missing in the presentation.
So before I jump into the actual details, I'd want to mention that you'll see a number of a fair amount of numbers coming up, in the ensuing slides. And in terms of references, I'd want to make sure folks understand, everything that you're seeing referenced here comes from the Mass Department of Revenue website in terms of what they call their at-a-glance reports that provide detailed information about every community in the Commonwealth. And it's actually FY08, I should also mention, which is the latest data that they still have that they've made available publicly through that source. So probably most folks, at least on the board, maybe some less so in the audience, probably already understand that our current North Reading tax policy is to have a single tax rate, which is applied evenly to both residential and commercial property. This policy makes North Reading an outlier with respect to surrounding communities, and in the definition of surrounding communities for this purpose is North Reading, North Reading's neighbors and North Reading's neighbors' neighbors. So if you look at it as basically two concentric circles around North Reading, we have 22 neighbors that fit that definition. 17 of them, which is over 3/4, already have a split tax rate, and I'm going to show you the map of sort of who that is and what the relativities are. And where do we stand within the individual rates in comparison? So our residential rate is very high relative to what I would define as at least the geographic peer group. We're the 4th highest residential rate within the surrounding area. Our commercial rate is very low compared to the same peer group. It's the 5th lowest out of 23 in total, which would be the 22 neighbors and neighbors' neighbors and North Reading itself. North Reading is actually the only community in the entire sample that has a residential rate in the top 5 and a commercial rate in the bottom 5. So my interpretation of that is, from an equity perspective, we have some arguably some inequitable distribution of where the tax burden is here, distributed here relative at least to other communities, again, within our geographic area. So this is a map, fairly simplistic, but again, you'll see, North Reading close to the center there. It's color-coded. The purple communities have split tax rates, and the yellow communities have single tax rates. I would acknowledge that there probably on any number of interpretations that could be drawn from this slide. I would say that, again, we are in the small minority relative to the surrounding communities. I actually personally would look at this and also suggest that the majority of, with the exception of Reading, the majority of the communities in yellow are actually in the east, to our east, arguably more rural, less proximate to commerce centers than North Reading is with respect to both I-93 and I-95 and some of the advantages of our location. And then Drakeage is in the extreme northwest of the comparison area. But again, the totals is, the total are North Reading, our neighbors, and our neighbors' neighbors. This shows you the actual residential rates for these 23 communities on the left-hand side, and you'll see North Reading is 4th from the top, just behind Andover and just ahead of North Andover, but pretty high up on the list when it's sorted in descending order. Our commercial tax rate is again at the bottom. It's highlighted and bolded. It's lower than, it's the 5th lowest. And as I said earlier, we're the only community, if you scrutinize both those lists, that have a residential rate in the top 5 and a commercial rate in the bottom 5. So one thing I'd want to address sort of right out of the gate, because I would guess it would be an issue that would be brought up by folks that have studied and understand this topic well, is that it is true that the creation of a split tax rate in isolation doesn't create additional revenue. It basically redistributes the existing tax burden within different classes of taxpayers. So basically the Proposition 2.5 levy limit, I believe is the term, the most appropriate term. The levy limit is not impacted at all by a redistribution of the tax burden through tax classification, which is another term for the split tax rate. I personally, though, do believe, and I think the majority of them, or actually maybe not all, were we unanimous on this one, by the way? So we were unanimous on this topic in the FAC. Also believe that the split tax rate would create greater equity by allocating a larger share of the tax burden to commercial properties. So the proposed approach is to create a split tax rate and essentially to establish the commercial rate 21% higher than the residential rate. That's the level that would be necessary to allocate all of the existing Proposition 2.5, all of the FY10 Proposition 2.5 increased revenue would be allocated under this model to the commercial property owners. We would then have to package this plan with an override, that would be set based on the residential rate increasing 2.5%. And the residential rate increasing 2.5% is essentially the path that we would be going down if we were maintaining the single tax rate that we have today. So So you could very plausibly and very honestly tell the residents of this community that, they are not paying more under this plan than they would be under the alternative of maintaining the single tax rate. And if the override were then to be successful in that context, it would create an additional, it's just under 800,000, I want to say 790-something thousand dollars in additional revenue through the Proposition 2.5 override. And again, I think it's important to really emphasize the fact that from a residential taxpayer perspective, they would not be paying any more under this alternative than they would be under the maintenance of a single tax rate without an override. If you then look at our math and say, would that be what would the impact of that be on the commercial rate, or I should say the resulting commercial and residential rates? Our residential rate would still remain the 4th highest of the 23 communities, and our commercial rate would become the 8th lowest as opposed to the 5th lowest. So our commercial rate, even after this plan, would still be below 2/3 of the surrounding communities in terms of a equity and a comparison. And that actually is the end of my presentation. I would want to also mention one other point, which I also didn't put in the slides, but I think is very relevant. I understand that this topic has been discussed at points in the past within this community, and I think there's always been, at least as I've understood it, some concerns around the relative size of our commercial tax base relative to other communities. Currently, if you look at our FY08 distribution of taxable property within North Reading, we have basically an 88% of our tax base is residential. And so some might suggest that's a small commercial tax base to create this split rate on. But if you look at the 5 communities that have not split their tax rate to date, 4 of those 5 actually have equal size or smaller commercial tax bases than North Reading does. Linfield, let me make sure I get which ones I'm talking about here. Linfield, Stoneham, North Andover, and Lynn have split tax rates and a equal or smaller commercial base as a portion of the total than we do. And there's only one community that has a single tax rate and a larger commercial base than we do, and that's Middleton. So from a equity perspective, personally, I don't believe this is at all an unreasonable plan. I think it creates more equity. It allows for the potential successful passage of an override. If folks are opposed to this plan, I would respectfully ask, what is our alternative given our current situation? It's never pleasant to raise someone's taxes this significantly. I would suggest that you keep in mind that where the resulting commercial rate would be is still well below the average. It would be 21% higher than the residential rate. Of the 17 communities with split tax rates, the average ratio of the commercial rate to the residential rate is just under 2 to 1. It's about 190%. The commercial rate is 190% plus of the residential rate. This is not at all inhospitable to the business community. It also is by no means the high end of the relationship. If you look at the high end, which is Burlington of these communities, the commercial rate is nearly 3 times what the residential rate is. And this is not an artificial subsidy of the residential taxpayers. The residential taxpayers under this plan are still the 4th highest out of 23.
Mike,
Yes.
the 21% relates to a 2.5% savings in the individual taxpayer. Is that where that number comes from?
The 21% comes from what would the commercial rate have to be to maintain the residential rate flat with last year and still raise overall
Right, that's what I thought, right.
Yes.
So the objective, the idea behind this then would be to convince the public that since they're not going to get a tax increase, right, that they should accept the 2.5% tax increase by way of an override.
Yes.
To raise the levy limit accordingly.
That's
That's
exactly
the essence of this proposal.
Yes.
And when you looked at the surrounding communities, with respect to the, excuse me a minute, I've lost my train of thought.